How valuable is an action? Because not all actions are created equally, even within a character's own turn, within a character's party, within enemies. All kinds of things can make actions worth different values, and there are a lot of abilities that you effectively trade actions from your side for actions on the enemy side. And it also will tell you how to evaluate buff spells and things of that nature. But before we get into any of that stuff, we need to first agree on what is the purpose of damage. Because this is what damage effectively is. It is a progress bar to end a fight. Now, if you are a damaged character, that means your entire job is to watch a progress bar move. Now, if you start playing your supports, just remember, you're the progress bar guy. And what this means is, once that progress bar hits full, the fight's over, you win. And in a boss fight, there aren't any increments in there that make any of the enemies weaker. But if you're in encounter against a bunch of small guys, you can immediately have impact at certain thresholds where you kill off the individual minions. So damage can actually affect the next turns of the fight and how they play out if there are a lot of small guys on the enemy side of the board. However, in those solo boss fights, you don't have those thresholds to make the enemy weaker. So they're going to be fully strong at 1 HP as they were at 100. So, as such, the purpose of damage is to progress a fight to its closed and finished state. So if you don't have damage, the fight will not end. However, damage will not make life easier for you in the meantime unless you're actually using it to kill something. So, now let's discuss different classes doing damage in different scenarios to figure out whose actions are more valuable. And for this example, I'm going to go with a paladin and a barbarian, because they have very, very different damage outputs even at level 1. Because at level 1, you can be expecting the paladin to be dealing a d8 plus 4, where the barbarian is doing maybe a d12 plus 10. So clearly the barbarian is doing almost or even double the damage of your paladin per main attack. And that's a massive gap for boss fights and makes the barbarian's actions much more valuable because clearly, numerically, they are more valuable. The paladin gets its other benefits off turn with its reactions and lay on hands and all this other stuff. But in terms of who can push that progress bar the fastest, it's the barbarian. So barbarian, in terms of pure damage, has stronger actions. So then the champion might think, okay, how could I use my actions to better set up my friend, whose actions are clearly slightly more valuable than mine? And my answer is, of course, grapple, wrestler type, haha, funny, make them flat-footed, your allies get benefit, and that enemy will need to waste turns if they want to get out of your headlock. So because of that, you can trade your less valuable resource, your actions, for the more valuable resource of the barbarian's actions. And you still get to have all your off-turn utility and defensiveness. So this is an example of how in a party, two martials can be using their actions to support each other. Now, a barbarian or a fighter, they tend to be very, very high damage, and their actions tend to be very, very valuable. Where if you look at something like champion, its main value is its off-turn ability, so it is a very good candidate for trying to use these maneuvers to trade actions. But I think that I first need to discuss multi-attack penalty before this goes any further, because not all the actions within the same turn are of equal value. For a martial, their most valuable action is their first attack. So, if you have an ability to make a strike within your turn, or use an attack action of a grapple, a trip, something, you should always have the goal of using your multi-attack penalty somehow. I do not really care how you are choosing to use that multi-attack penalty. It is a resource that goes away at the end of your turn. So you should be trying to burn that every single turn. And let me give you an example. If you are a monk, you spent 2 actions getting into combat. You could either go into your stance that increases your damage for the rest of the fight, or Flurry of Blows that turn. I say you still Flurry of Blows that turn to mark the damage on them. Because you can still go into that stance next turn, the enemy isn't likely to be getting so far away from you, you need to spend 2 actions to chase them again. And just do the math if you are not believing me there. Let's say you are a dexterity monk. You have d6 basic fist attack, and you want to go into wolf stance, which will have your fist die go to a d8. So that is a damage increase of about 20 to 25%, assuming you have no strength. Okay? That means you need to be chasing them around, having this exact scenario happen 4 turns in a row for the changing into the stance to be the correct play. Just go for at least 1 attack per turn, unless there's some really massive circumstance outside of it that does not allow you to do so. Because your multi-attack penalty is your most valuable thing as a marshal. Always try to do something that gets you a multi-attack penalty by the time your turn is over. Because that is how you actually make progress on that loading bar. And if you're not making progress on that loading bar as a marshal or trading your actions or doing something, you're wasting value because your first attack is more valuable than basically every other action in the game. Because a lot of the other actions are balanced to be roughly equivalent to that second attack, that -5 attack. So raising a shield, you should think that is roughly equivalent to the -5 attack in terms of value, and that's situational which one you'd pick. It is pretty much always better than a third attack though, because third attacks are designed to be much weaker than everything else. And the game designers did it this way, so that fights will have progress marked on that bar, and they will eventually end, because striking once per turn is just so good. I highly recommend you try to attack at least once per turn. But let's move on to a spellcastery example. Now, spellcasters have a little bit more nuance in how much their actions are worth. A lot of spellcasters believe that it is their job to cast a 2-action spell every turn, do something with the third action, and then pass. I don't necessarily believe that's true. I think that's true in like 70% of what spellcasters should be doing. However, they're also high mental stats, and they can use several of these third actions together to get great value. And a lot of their spells don't give them multi-attack penalty, so they can also make a weapon strike at no multi-attack penalty. And I've seen a lot of people complain that spellcasters don't have the accuracy that marshals do, but compare the accuracy of a spellcaster to the accuracy of a marshal's second strike, and tell me who is better. That's right, the spellcaster. So, if your marshals are very frequently going for these second strikes and that looks good enough to you, why can't you go for your own strike? It's a single action thing. You have an action left over after your 2-action spell, so make a bow strike. Make a short sword strike, you know? There are finesse weapons that can be pretty easily accessed via feats or whatever that casters can make great use of. So I like playing strength casters that have medium armor for that reason, because they give me this incredibly powerful third action. And also, if you're fine with not casting a 2-action spell every turn, that makes it way easier for you to conserve spell slots. And if you're going into things like Wrestler to get combat grab, that gives you something to do while you have multi-attack penalty as you're playing as this Diet Marshal that then fades back into being a support spellcaster, which is the main thing I like doing on my War Priests. But with that idea of spellcasters can still make a strike because their strike is better than a Marshal's second attack, and Marshal's second attacks are still good, you can now see that spellcasters can play the 3-action economy quite a lot. You just can't be doing your big spell and then a bunch of things at once. You could do a turn that's a bunch of things at once. For example, if there's like a low health enemy you know you need to shoot, you can then decide if you need to cast a buff spell, if you want to debuff them, if you want to then move and go for recall knowledge. Like, there's still a lot that a spellcaster can do. It's just that a lot of people get caught up on, but they have -2 or -3 accuracy compared to XY Marshal at XY level, that they don't think, well, that Marshal tends to throw out attacks at a -5 multi-attack penalty all the time. So I'm not saying that is the primary thing that every spellcaster should be doing all the time, but I see too many, especially new players, get trapped in the mindset of, it is my job to always be casting my spell, and then having no idea what to do with the third action, where a lot of time when I'm playing spellcasters, I'm chaining together third actions and using my spells for when they are most wanted or needed. Like, of course, I'll take my range damage cantrip and I'll be blasting that out. And then I treat a lot of my spells as, when this perfect scenario comes up, I will then have this spell here ready. And I lean on being an off marshal, or lean on being a high utility being on the battle map on the moments where that utility is not exactly needed. Because in that way, I can better conserve my limited resources and have a lot more say in what is going on, while still being pretty good impact in a lot of these fights. So that's my advice to the spellcasters. Now let's move on to how things would interact with enemies, because that will have me be able to go back to spellcaster thing and give a little bit more nuance. First, I want to discuss why boss fights are so scary, though. Because boss fights, as I mentioned before, do not get weaker when their damage gets lower. However, the party can. Because when you get knocked out, you move initiative order, you drop all your stuff, you're prone, a bunch of bad stuff happens all at once. And even when they're healed back up, they might still need some recovery time. If that boss has attack of opportunity, I'm sorry, you are staying on the ground. Well, it's rough. So the boss can effectively cut your party strength down to 3/4 pretty early in a fight, and then you're fighting a fair fight. And a fair fight is one that you have a 50% chance to lose. So when people say that they get TPK'd by bosses a lot, I understand that. Because if the boss gets a lucky crit and they move before you because they have a higher perception, because Pathfinder 2 math, they could shift this fight into being very much a neutral fight that is then very losable for the party. So, because of that, I think that damage's purpose in a boss fight is to just lower the progress bar. However, that is not really the primary objective in boss fights. At least in my opinion. Because, yeah, getting them to 0 is how you inevitably win. However, you need to make sure that you have that safety and that space to be able to do the damage. And that's where the utility abilities come in. Because, if you think about it, if you are a 4-man party going in against a level +3, level +4 ultra super boss with no minions, if you are a grappler, for example, and you trip them, make them grappled, they then need to use that most viable attack to get out of your grabbed condition, and they will then need to stand, so you have traded 2 of your actions for 2 of theirs, and one of those being their most valuable, their first attack, so that they can simply get back up and reset back to a neutral position. Mind you, you need to get lucky as the grappler to do this, but you have traded 2 of your team's 12 actions for 2 of their 3. Which is such a massive difference, and in Magic Gathering terms, you basically time walk them, where you just take an extra turn for your entire group, and you just get an extra round to just wail on them, and then suddenly the boss fight looks incredibly easy. And Spellcaster can do similar gimmicks with slow. Even if slow is a successful save, you traded 2 of your actions for 1 of theirs. So your party has 10 of their 12 actions, they have 2 of 3. The party has still won that interaction, but it did cost you a resource. Still, slow is an immensely good spell in boss fights, even on that successful save, because of just how the math of solo bosses work out. I always take slow on my casters that can take it, because it's just that valuable. And I've seen a lot of complaints about spellcasters saying that they simply don't do enough damage. However, I think that it would be a waste of a spellcaster's talents to reduce themselves to bar fillers. I think that's the job of the meat sticks. You know, let the meat sticks handle the filling of the progress bar while you are the manipulator of the entire battlefield. Now, if that is still something you want to do, if you still want to play a blaster, I now have a good answer for you. Kineticist gives you a lot of those things that you are looking for as an explosive, potentially high damage spell user. By removing the spell list, by removing the utility box and just replacing it with spec into what you want, and you can choose full damage. Especially Fire Kineticist. Fire Kineticist, if you want to do that stuff, grab Fire, grab one of the elements that has like a D8 close range strike, or Elemental Blast I should say, and that's where you should go for Magical Blaster. But, as a whole, the goal of a party in those solo boss fights should be to force the enemy to waste their actions. Because if you can get that enemy to waste their actions, you are wasting their time to be able to kill you, and then your damage monkeys, that just want to fill the progress bar, can fill that goddamn progress bar for as long as they want. And against bosses, I should also say that those second attacks become much worse because they're much less likely to hit, so going for literally anything else after that first strike becomes very, very valuable. And that's all I'm going to say on boss fights, because in those smaller mini encounters, damage can actually also eliminate enemy actions by killing things. So damage becomes a form of crowd control. And I think that's why a lot of newer players do not struggle with the swarm encounters as much, because newer tables tend to have a lot of characters that just focus on dealing damage, because that is immediately apparent why that is useful. It immediately seems good, and therefore, why shouldn't a new player group have a fighter, a barbarian, and a rogue all run in there and start smashing stuff? And against these small creatures that you're likely to beat an initiative because how the math works in Pathfinder, and then you just smack them, you potentially one-shot them, and then the enemies have fewer actions on their even first turn, and you just lowered the entire difficulty in the encounter with some good rolls early. Bosses can do the exact opposite, which is why boss fights are so much swingier. I'm not going to say that they're infinitely harder, but you just need to use different tactics that tend to be only seen at the higher power, more advanced tables. But they also have the highest chance to go wrong, because also there are fewest dice rolls in there, so the law of big numbers can't apply, and blah, 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 blah. Boss fights tend to be more dangerous, especially early, especially with new players, because they can lead to these death spirals where you're using healing to just mitigate very little of that guy's turn, and they're just able to keep on walking over you because you can never really get an advantage by grabbing them and denying their actions preemptively. So, in the scenario against the boss, you really want to trade actions with them. However, if there are, like, 8 tiny goblins, and your fighter trades action for action with one of the goblins, you lose that exchange, because now your party only has 11 of 12, they still have 23 of 24. And that is a winning exchange for the goblins. So, grappler-type characters tend to be worse in these form encounters, but that's where the rest of the kit comes in. Because a lot of the grabbing characters are not just about grabbing. They also are high-strength characters, so they have at least decent damage on weapon strikes, and if they're a caster, they have their full spell list that they are still useful with. And yeah, they have some feats that are dead or less useful, but they're still strong enough, and a lot of characters do build, just incidentally, to be pretty good into groups of enemies. And as I said before, you can tend to knock some of them out, and then that makes the fight easier, so then you can clean that up if you have the healing and resources to be able to, well, get to the end of it. Boss fights do not have that pressure release valve, so that's why I build a lot of my characters to be more tailored against boss fights. And the damage in the weaker fights against all the minions is about removing things from action economy, period. Wholesale, and that effectively makes the fight easier for every future turn. In a boss fight, the goal of damage is to eventually bring it to a close, but in a boss fight, it is much slower tempo. And tempo being how much it affects the fight right in that instance. I think debuffs have the highest potential tempo, like buffs and debuffs, because they immediately affect something that turn. If you can deny the boss their next turn, you completely get an next turn for everybody immediately, and that's extremely powerful right there, and it does not matter what the boss HP is, that is always pretty much just as good. Where buff spells, they can then be used immediately and then continue giving value. So buff spells change the nature of the fight pretty much the moment they are cast. And mind you, this isn't true for something like a self-casted haste, because you do not get that quick condition until the start of your next turn, which puts it on a slower tempo than if you cast it on the ally that is coming next in initiative order. So keep that in mind if you're playing a spellcaster with haste. Now, I feel like that is a pretty good basic overview of the topic, but let me know if I missed anything or you disagree with me in the comment section down below. And, well, I got a new microphone. You can expect more videos like this one to be coming out soon. Yeah, that's all I have for you.